Okay. So we're going to do some history, Earl and I, today. So I thought I would uh, go and do some background information, not of public banking, but generally why look at history and what we can learn from it and what we avoid by not looking at history. So that's the idea. Okay. So here are the three possible reasons for looking at history. Can show us what is possible. This is something that I learned, if it required learning, from my mentor, Kenneth Boulding, in the 1960s at Boulder, University of Colorado in Boulder. That is to say, if it's happened, it's obviously possible. Because this was a kind of response to people that say things are not possible. And here looking at history, we can show that certain things, even though improbable or even though people have opposed it or don't believe it, nevertheless, it has happened. And if it's happened, it's possible. So that's one of the reasons to look into history. Secondly, it can show us what good results and not so good results can come from pursuing a new way. So we can see the consequences of our ideas ahead of them being implemented because they have already happened, either in the way that we suggested, but certainly somehow or other that it's not impossible. And we also have some details about when it does happen, what are there's evidence for some good results, and we've got to be careful of some unwanted side effects as well. And that's very, very important knowledge when we are attempting to convince others of something new. And then the other thing that applies to public banking or to democracy or to other things as well is that although something happened and it was possible and even it was good, nevertheless, the opposition or people who don't like it for whatever purpose can undermine it. So the fact that it does happen and that there are some good results doesn't mean that it will pertain, that it will continue. So we've got to be careful of how to see to it that once something good has happened, how it can be undermined and to avoid the undermining. So I find that these are very important things for looking at history. Now, one must, when we're proposing new things, there are three things that can happen. One is objections. The other one is opposition. And the third one that for me finally landed in my consciousness because of the amount of indifference that we've seen with respect to public banking on the part of the politicians. So objections means that people have some kind of a question that they have that they need answering. It's not that they are opposed, but they need more information, they need more knowledge. They will say, for example, in public banking, hey, listen, they don't say this, but they're implying we're not necessarily opposed to public banking. Indeed, we have found a number of people who have said, hey, we're open-minded, but they still don't do anything. So when we ask them, well, what is it that your objections are about? So we can respond to them. And they will say whatever it is that they object to. Sometimes the objections are manufactured. They're not real objections. Sometimes they need clarification. For example, with public banking, they will say it's not constitutional or it's not legal. So we respond to that. by evidence that it is indeed so. The second one is opposition. Now, opposition means that even though it's likely a good idea, we don't want it. We don't want public banking. Of course, they have to camouflage it by saying that there are good reasons for not wanting it. But the real objection is that this new idea goes against our own interests, or go against our own view of the political and economic realm, or my own view about money and things of that nature, and that money cannot really be created out of nothing. And so I oppose it ideologically. And the third one, and that's the one that I know that most of you will say, well, wake up, Alec, for goodness sake, why so late in your life? But I've found that another response to new ideas is that there is indifference. There's indifference. So let me go to the next slide because I have answers to that. So with respect to objections, then one of the principal things that we have used and others can use is to clarify and instruct again and again, not just once, not just twice, but many times over. So somebody is going to say, well, it's not legal in Colorado, or it is legal, but other things obstruct are going ahead with picking up the legislation and passing the legislation. So you have to clarify time and time again. And all of us, but in particular Earl, with the legal stuff, has time and again pointed out where the questions are open to question, that what they say is the difficulty is not a difficulty, but it has to be repeated time again and come from a different place so that you adapt to the personalities and the interests of particular people. So that's a very, very important skill to have, and also a commitment. The second thing is for opposition, why do you don't want public banking? Well, because it takes away my financial interest, because it takes away my power. So if I'm addicted to my self-interest and power, then I won't change, no matter how much you have convincing evidence that my opposition is mistaken, because I don't care about other people's opinion or what have you. I have power, I have money, I have self-interest, I have a particular philosophical point of view, if you can call it that, and I'm not moving. And I put after the period there, I say puzzled as to how to attend to that. One of the things that some of you, not some of you here, but Earl has heard me say is, for instance, my difficulty in understanding why a person who has $1 billion will spend any valuable time of his life getting a second $1 billion. I don't understand why anybody would spend any effort getting a second $1 billion when you have $1 billion, or even with smaller amounts of money. So I've reverted to give an explanation to myself to say that these people are addicted, literally addicted, medically and psychologically addicted. That is to say, in the same way that a drug addict is. Obviously, in some place in his mind, a drug addict knows that having another drug and another drug and another drug is not going to make him happy, or is not going to make him any safer. But nevertheless, he goes ahead and has another drug. My own sense is that the two most powerful addictions of humankind are power and money, more than anything else, or at least that's my conclusion. And as we all know, conclusions are always temporary until something else comes up and gives a better explanation. The third one is that some some people oppose it because of indifference, not because of indifference, but they just are indifferent. Um, and that I'm looking at why people might be indifferent. I really tend to go away from labeling people as bad. I tend to say that they do bad things, or they do selfish things, or they do things that produce pain or suffering, but I don't say that they are bad and that's why they behave that way. Because if they're just bad, like a bad seed, then you can't hold them responsible. That's in their DNA. They're just born that way. And I've spent this last year struggling with this issue of why do people behave badly, either a great deal or less or barely at all the time or some of the time or rarely never. So I seek to find explanations as to their behavior. And I say, with respect to indifference, that this indifference is due, some of the indifference is due to numbing through social media and advertising. Watching television, even, in good with good programs, or anyway, programs that are judged to be good, interesting, artistically viable, etc. And then when it comes to a break with an advertisement, the advertisements are just appalling. They take away from any reason or emotional connection. They just appeal to the unconscious to just buy. So there's a kind of numbing that comes through advertising and also social media that we have encountered, especially recently with all these murders. But much more generally, there's been a very fierce critique of social media precisely because they produce this numbing. The other reason that I've thought of for uh, indifference is due to poverty or to, even with middle class now. I mean, the vast majority of people in the middle class are involved with how to pay for rent, how to pay for food, how to get a little bit of holiday here and there. I'm not talking about poor people, I'm talking about even the middle class. So that they have absolutely no time, no interest to understand and to participate in the political and economic arena. And the second reason is that there's miseducation. I mean, we've done away with civics. I mean, take it from me, and I'm not saying that because I'm so terribly virtuous, but when I first came to the United States in 1964 and went to Berkeley, certainly I learned a number of things, but one of the things that surprised me, even though I was, early in my 20s, I was surprised at how little Americans knew about Europe and how much, even of a small country of Greece, I knew about the United States. And I say it not to say something positive about myself. I'm just saying as a fact, that was the case. And that means that, there's miseducation, uh, certainly not widely spread, but also miseducation. That is to say, bad education. And then we have an additional problem. And this is the principal problem that I think overshadows everything else. unlike other times and other places, e.g., women's campaign for voting rights, which took 50 years, and sorry, there's two ands there, and fleeing Nazis and communists, we have neither the time or the places to flee to. In other words, we can't take 50 years to attend to some very, very severe problems. They need to be um, solved within the next 10 or 15 years maximum. That's what we're told. So there is an urgency, since we must attend to existential problems here and now, not in other places. You could flee Nazis, but where are you going to go? You know, or lots of people can go if there's Nazism or there's communism in the bad sense of dictatorship, of Stalinism, for example, or Hitlerism, or Pol Pot, or anything of the sort. You know, where are you going to go? You can't flee elsewhere, and we don't have time. There's an urgency to deal with these things. Okay, let's see. Then there is the next slide. So I've spent quite a bit of time, not for this session, but in general, to try and find out what are the existential problems that face mankind, not only in the United States, but anywhere in the world. So I've divided them into four. They're obviously interrelated, but all other problems I maintain. I might obviously be wrong, but that's what my attempt was, is to bring forward the major existential categories and to be as exhaustive as I can. In other words, there are these four, and all the others are subsets of these four. So the vertical side of things is on the political realm, and the one on the horizontal is uh, the economic realm. So up on top is democracy versus autocracy. Now we're really in the midst of it in the United States and all over the world. That democracy, even as I maintain, when people in the United States and in the media talk about our democracy, um, they, I think, assume, or they speak as if the democracy in the United States or in other Western countries, but let's talk about the United States, is something that was accomplished more or less. Yes, there were a few things to fix here and there, but by and large, we had our democracy. My own sense is that that is an illusion. That what we had is very mediocre democracy, and that now it's gotten worse, and we have autocratic tendencies that are very, very real indeed. I'll talk about that, especially in response to comments and questions later on. The second one is peace versus war and nonviolence and violence. I think that that is, especially with war and nuclear powers, but also violence and nonviolence here at home, with shootings of 18-year-olds, of children, and all sorts of other extremely violent expressions in the movies. I'm very glad that I can go to the movies again, but again, the 4 or 5 next movies that are going to be shown are virtually entirely speckled with violence and machinery, very mechanical kind of violence. So that's the second one that I think is on the political level, existential problem. And I'll explain later in the next slide as to what I mean by existential, in case we differ about the what we mean by the term. And then on the left, distribution of wealth and power and debt. Um, I think that inequality and unjustified distribution of wealth leads to very, very large uh, distinctions in power, which obviously affects democracy, but also affects peace and war, and also debt uh, with the discovery, of course, that one of the principal ways, all the way back to Sumer and Babylon, that the principal way that people at the top of the heap, whether they are um, kings or queens, or whether they are dictators of some kind or another, or even civilians who picked up power, the principal way in which they dominate people is not through violence, but through debt. This is a very recent discovery, at least for me, but also for the work of social scientists and historians and anthropologists that have discovered the extensive use of debt for enslaving people. So that's this slide. And um, let's see, I had something else here. Okay, well, I'll get to it perhaps. So by existential, I mean threatening the existence of mankind and the earth. So when we make a proposal for changing, it is our responsibility to show how what we propose will contribute to any or all of the existential issues without harming any. So it's not as if, okay, you solve the problem, let's say, of the environment, or did did I skip on the environment? Let me see a moment. Oh yeah, sorry, I skipped on the right side of the horizontal, which is steady state economics and spaceship Earth. And this is virtually entirely what I learned from Kenneth Boulding in the 60s, and that barely any other economist or at the time or any other economics department was involved with talking about that. And it's one of the things that impressed me even from the very beginning when I met him, and I actually happened to write my dissertation under him, and he was the chair of my committee, is that uh, was a member of the economics department in Boulder, and that his office was outside of the building of the economics department. Isn't it amazing? He's the only economist in uh, uh, the University of Colorado that had an office in another building altogether. It's very, very intriguing. Anyway, so I forgot to tell you about that as the fourth existential problem. So we can't grow anymore in order to solve the problem of poverty, let's say. And also, even if we could grow and did grow, we would destroy the environment for the for younger people today, and also for other generations. And that is something that I think is somewhat explanatory for this fantastic increase in the rate of suicides for very young people. I have a friend of mine, he's about 3 years younger than I, and he has a daughter who's a pediatrician, and she's has to face the fact that some of her young patients of 12 or 10 have committed suicide. I mean, imagine. uh, I don't know about any of you, but I'm sure that there was the case, as with me, that there was no such occasion that I could remember at the age of 10 or 12 or older for that matter, that had that kind of despair, if you will, at such a young age. My own sense is, I haven't seen any written material on it, is that the increased violence amongst young people and racism and authoritarianism in very young people also comes out of a sense of despair. All right. So the next one, by existential, I mean the threatening, I already read that. So not only is it the case that we have a responsibility to attend to that, we can't anymore say, well, I don't know what to do. If you don't know what to do or what to say, then ask somebody that knows or that claims to know. We can't stand on the fence. And this is the one thing that my participation in public banking in Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute has become a real mystery. And okay, guys, if you don't think that public banking is a good thing, what do you think is a good thing? You can't anymore just sit on criticism. There is a fundamental responsibility now to say, what else would you do instead? And obviously, to suggest things that will not only solve one of the existential, or more than one existential problem, but without harming any of the others. And then it would be even better if we can show our proposal will be compatible with other proposals and contribute into any other ideas and practices that are proposed by others. So, for example, how is public banking, let's say, compatible and helpful in land value tax or in um, a public income, an annual or monthly public income, universal public income, or how will public banking contribute to reducing the danger of climate catastrophe, that sort of thing. So to be aware of the systemic nature of problems rather than treating them as if they are alone. And this is, by the way, one of Bolding's contribution, by the way, was systems theory, general systems theory, together with Balfilamfi in the early 60s. He also, by the way, was involved with probably one of the first analyses of what he called the grants economy. That is to say, all of economics that is taught is usually taught as if you had the economy is about market systems and exchanges. No, he said that a big part of the economy, and he studied it, is a one-way transfer, just like a parent to a child. They don't say, I'm going to give you food and I'm going to give you a roof over your head, but you must do such and such. No, it's unconditional. It's as if the child had a right to have this parental caring. And that's what we mean by right. It's something that one has not earned, but is due. And we even accuse parents, right, of negligence. And I had an early discussion, not an early, about a year ago with Earl from a legal point of view. Can we hold any political actor or a politician guilty of negligence? In other words, if you do not attend to the homeless and a young child who's homeless dies, can you say that you've killed that child as clearly as not a parent not feeding the child or chaining it to a post, do I know, like they do with dogs and other animals? Is there a case to be made for legally considering negligence when there are things that need to be done and done very quickly and not superficially, and you don't do them, and as a result of that, you harm people or harm animals or harm the environment, can you be held responsible for negligence? I think that it might be worth, even on a moral level, to consider it, and not only legal, because I would think that that would be very, very difficult. Okay, so this is something that I've come up with. Uh, Again, in the last year, I've been doing a lot of internal kind of considerations because of my puzzlement as to what is going on in the world. And I say, uh, our situation is not about what our situation is not about. It's not about being liberal or conservative. I don't care if you're liberal or conservative. What I care about is what you stand for and on what spiritual or philosophical grounds you take that stand. You can't just say, well, I stand for killing people. What do you want from me? No, no, you have to justify it in terms of a spiritual or a philosophical position. And it's not about more or less compromise. I have become very impatient with people that talk about compromise. You know, I find that that is, again, very superficial. I mean, imagine if during the War of Independence in the United States, we said, well, we're going to be independent of Britain, but only for 7 of the 13 uh, you know, original places, right? No, we said all or nothing. It's what I'm going for, in other words, is what I would call a social Copernical revolution. You can't just say it's the Earth is either round or flat. You can't just say, oh well, we'll find something in the middle. No, no, one is not so and one is so, even though the church for 200 years went after these characters that were essentially telling us about certain things, that they are so and not otherwise, even though in the past we believed that it was a different way for so many thousands of years. Or the the sun revolves around the earth? No, it's the earth that revolves around the sun. There's no compromise about that. Also, not more or less government. It's because you can have more government or less government and still do bad things. It's not a matter of the size of the government, it's the quality of the government that matters. And so you can have a smaller government, as the conservatives might want to do, but you let all sorts of terrible things continue to happen. Or you might have a very big government, and you can have Stalinism, for goodness sake. So it's not about those things. We need to be much more refined in our thinking and our positioning. This is not about smarter or more efficient government or corporations. I don't want a thief or a criminal to become more efficient. What is this and being enamored with efficient government or efficient corporations? It matters what it is that they do. And if they do bad things, I want them to be terribly inefficient. And also about smarter government or smarter corporations. Smarter governments can be more smart in being autocratic. And the same thing with corporations. You can find very smart ways of getting the work done in terms of labor, let's say, but also not paying your people well. So you can be smart at, in the sense of efficient, if you will, but doing very great harm to the society as a whole. This is about revolution in consciousness, in thinking, in ethics, and in practice. It's no good having better ideas. You've got to show that they are ethically um, good as well. And again, it's not sufficient to be in favor of doing good things, whereas, and just sit on how good ideas you have and how, if they were put into practice, they would be a good thing. You've got to participate anymore as a citizen in the practice of these ideas. That's one of my favorite little pieces here. If one is traveling full speed towards a cliff to avoid catastrophe, mass murder, mass extinction, one must not merely slow down, one must change direction. One must change direction. If any of you are interested in any religious orientation in this, you know, from the point of view of Jesus, he says, metanoia, change your mind, go in a different direction. This is not slowing down or become a little bit less evil. You've got to, you have to allow yourself to have something happen in you that you change your whole direction. Okay. One last thing that has engaged me quite some time over the meaning of the term we the people and the common good. I keep making these statements, and then people, of course, are saying, well, it depends on what you mean by common good and we the people. And so I've come at least with this proposal. Consider that there are not two seats of power, but three: the individual person, the family, the corporation. And we have said that, the United States has become hyper individualist. Then there is the government, that some people, especially liberals, have associated it with democracy. It's somehow or other, the government represents the public will. And of course, there is a third um, source of power or base of power, and it's we the people. And Lincoln's definition of that is government of the people, by the people, for the people. And so I looked up some time ago, but I had to remind myself about what each of them meant, because they become, very, how shall I say, tame, and yet they contain an enormous amount of wisdom. So, let's see, by the people, of the people, coming out of the people, not coming out of, um, uh, coming out of, not made, sorry, not made up of, um, I'm sorry, let me just concentrate a moment. We the people, government of the people is that the the governing is done of the people. Yes, made of people that come from the people. They don't come from corporations. They don't come from universities. They don't come. They're just people. Secondly, by the people, voted by people in general, but again, not voted in by money or corporations or power or the army for that matter, and for the people, that is to say, in the interest of the people, not again in the interest of a politician who wants to be re-elected, or the interest of the corporation, etc. So it's important to bring back that notion of democracy that is extraordinarily participatory and not representative democracy. And I'll finish with this. Um, there was such a thing as not Greek democracy. There's never Greek democracy, even today, in some measure. There was Athenian democracy, and only for about between 50 and 70 years. And the way it was structured is that people were chosen to govern by lottery, literally by lottery, so that they remained in power for a certain amount of time, and then they were released, and other people who were also chosen by lottery came in and governed the city-state in that case. In other words, it's just like we have in the United States and other countries of the world. You have, when you go to court, you can have what? A hearing that you have your fellow citizens that make decisions about very, very important things that can involve your life or imprisonment for a very long time. So essentially, it says that we trust ordinary people. Ordinary people, we don't have to have elites. We don't have to have only intelligent people or only people who have PhDs or only people who are wealthy. We have ordinary people. Some of them will be black, some of them will be tall, some of them will be intelligent, some of them would be great philosophers, some of them would be hungry, some of them would be homeless. Essentially what Lincoln is driving at, I think, is not representative democracy, but a democracy that is based um, on the confidence that we have on people in general to be able to govern themselves. And there's a series of books that I've collected, and one that I just received today is called Open Democracy by a woman by the name of Ellen Landemore, Landemore. Open Democracy, and she argues this case of having government being based on regular people sitting in the seat of government and making decisions and being responsible for discovering what constitutes the common good, and not only discovering it, but also working to apply uh, their policies for the furtherance of the common good. I'm going to skip on that word. Whoops, sorry. One more. So possible principles to live by expressed in economic, political, and social systems. I just took principles from various parts of the world, and one Swaraj, self-government, self-rule, and self-restraint from the Hindu tradition, Ubuntu from the African tradition. I am because of who we all are: human dignity, respect, compassion, solidarity, consensus. And Buen Vivir, good way of living, rooted in community and harmony with nature. This is from, obviously, you can tell from uh, the spelling that is from Latin America by and large. So that's what I have for you today, and it goes quite a bit away from the narrow consideration of public banking, but this is how I've come to conceive of public banking, that public banking serves those kinds of interests, and figuring out how to overcome the opposition and the deceits and lying in order to do something that can be really very, very good, and how to collaborate with other movements. So thanks.
Earl, are you going to go? You have slides to share?
Yes.
I don't have slides to share. I'm just going to speak.
All right. So, Alec, you may
yeah.
want to stop the screen share.
Yeah, and I'm looking to how to do it now.
There is a red button somewhere on the Zoom menu. It should be on top, I think.
Yeah, I
Stop
know
share
it.
screen. Let's see what I can do here.
Right, it's so large that there's no, let's see.
Okay. Good.
Oh. Oh, okay. Stop share. There we go.
Exactly.
Okay,
All
could you
right.
hear me all right?
Yes, he was fine.
Yes. All right.
So
I'm going to
sorry for
talk
being,
about.
I came from a very, very high level, not necessarily a good one, but that's what I was attempting to do.
All right. I'm going to focus on the history of public banks in the United States. And you'll see some of their effects. And hopefully this will illustrate some of the principles in favor of public banking and why turning that power over to private banks is a serious problem. I'm going to start with colonial America. Ben Franklin wrote that the colonies were not doing well. He was speaking mainly of Pennsylvania, but he was familiar with the other colonies. And until about 1723, when Parliament took action that enabled the colonies to create their own currency and pay British taxes with that currency, and also to make loans through land banks, for example. 6 years later, he wrote a pamphlet anonymously in 1729. And by the way, he was only 23 years old at the time. And he was praising paper money because by creating much more money through loans and direct use of currency to purchase goods and services for the colony of Pennsylvania and others had become very prosperous. And it was only years later that his identity as the author of that pamphlet became widely known, and that's available. You can check it out online. It's a very important tract by the young Franklin. And 1723 was fairly early in the colonial period. Over the next 41 years, until Parliament forbade the payment of any more British taxes with paper money, Franklin wrote that the colonies had become very prosperous. And this apparently motivated Parliament. In 1751, they at least partially restricted the creation of money by the colonies, but not completely. And the colonies sought ways around it and still remained quite prosperous. In 1764, Parliament prohibited the payment of taxes with paper money against Franklin's vigorous objection. He had gone to Britain to make a strong objection to the proposed prohibition on the payment of taxes with paper money, which would basically make it worthless for many purposes. And one of the problems that was later pointed out was that he it explained the reason the colonies were so prosperous was that they had this ability to create their own money. And Peter Cooper, a marvelous scholar and politician, wrote a book in 1883 in which he wrote that when Franklin explained the reason for our prosperity, they immediately passed laws prohibiting the payment of taxes in that money. And then after that happened, because the colonies were no longer able to generously produce that money, although they fought against it. It was written that a number of the colonies actually continued to defy Britain and that prohibition. But it was described as the most important issue leading to the hostility and distrust and disrespect for Great Britain by the colonies. However, the Declaration of Independence actually does not mention that they took our money away, which is rather surprising considering the evidence that that was perhaps the greatest cause. Peter Cooper actually wrote that Franklin in 1776 told Parliament that one reason for the impatience and disrespect shown by the colonies was the prohibition of making paper money. And Cooper commented that the action in ending money creation by the colonies was the principal cause of the revolution because it caused widespread unemployment, poverty, and presumably crime. And it wasn't the tax on tea or stamps, which had much less effect. And Franklin had also commented, and this is just common sense when you think about it, with its own money creation, he said that the colonies were the happiest and most prosperous place on earth. He was mainly comparing it with Great Britain, but he had also spent some time in France. And he said virtue was at an all-time high. I presume he's referring, among other things, to a low crime rate. Why not? Why steal when you have everything you need? And he observed that England, really the English people suffered a lot under their private central bank, the Bank of England, and had multiple wars draining their resources, just like, of course, the United States today. The next period after the revolution was after the Revolutionary War, during the revolution, the war was funded by the Articles of Confederation and the government issuing its own paper money, and they funded the government directly. It was extremely successful, and it was written by Tom Paine that it was a cornerstone of the revolution. However, that money was counterfeited very aggressively by the British. They brought printing machines over on their ships and contributed greatly to destroying the worth of that currency. And they also short sold that currency. And it did eventually wipe it out towards the end of the war, but not before the colonies had acquired the ability to defeat Great Britain. Most people did not really understand the role that counterfeiting had played in the collapse of the continental dollar. And as a result, when the Constitution was formed, the people who wrote it were unsure about clearly authorizing the creation of paper money. And they used language that authorized it to coin money. That's in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, authorizing Congress to coin money. Although the usage at the time shows that to coin money also included paper money, and the Supreme Court in 1871 and again in 1884 issued decisions that upheld paper money printed by the government under the Constitution. The 1884 case was Juilliard. And if any of you want the cite on that, I'll send it. It also cites the earlier case of Park versus Davis in 1871. But that's clearly the law, and Congress today could do that. And of course, Lincoln did it. But the other side of what happened with the new United States government was that the government did create a private national bank, the first bank of the United States, the first public bank of our actual United States government. That had a 20-year charter. It went from 1791 to 1811. But it had some serious flaws. The most serious was that it was 80% privately owned and was basically controlled by private interests. And eventually, the bank ran up quite a bit of debt. There were a lot of concerns about it. Jefferson made objections to it, and particularly to the handling of the accounts of Alexander Hamilton. He had opposed the bank and urged Washington not to approve it. But he failed to convince Washington of that. Alexander Del Mar is a major political economist of the middle to late 1800s. And he wrote a number of outstanding pieces on banking and public banking and finance. But he wrote that the United States had created this marvelous revolution, democratic revolution, but then it turned right around and basically gave it all away, in effect, by this first bank of the United States, 80% in private hands. That, by turning over the creation of money to private hands, you're creating a siphon of money from the people to the wealthiest, and from the 99% to the 1%. So that bank was not renewed. There's evidence that the Bank of England and the British may have deliberately caused the War of 1812 in order to cause a lot of debt for the United States and force them to create another Bank of the United States. That war was very costly. We ran up a lot of debt. And in 2016, the Congress created the second Bank of the United States, again with a 20-year charter. And that was signed into law by President James Madison. As you know, Andrew Jackson was very hostile to that bank and fought very hard towards the end of its charter to see that it was not renewed. And he was successful in that. And actually, Nicholas Biddle, who was the president of that bank, really was aligned with private banking interests and fought against Jackson, but failed, and then was charged with some crimes, and I think died not long after that. So what followed the end of that period was what has sometimes been called the free banking area, where many banks were authorized to issue paper money, what some called wildcat banking, essentially private currencies. But it did create a lot of money, and it did foster continued expansion of the United States, including further west. But there were a lot of problems created with these currencies, and again, having too much privately created money, where the incentive is often to speculate and create bubbles. There were repeated recessions. And finally, under Lincoln, in 1863, the National Banking Act was enacted, and that created the authorization to create what are called national banks, but that are founded at the state level, not within states, but are private. And someone could get a national charter as a national bank. And to this day, you can get a state bank that's chartered by the state and a national bank charter that is founded, that is chartered not by the state, but by the federal government through the comptroller of the currency, which oversees national banks, just as the Federal Reserve currently oversees the state chartered banks. In 1873, there was an act that restricted conversion of money, the conversion of silver, and it further restricted investment and growth, and led to a period of prolonged recession. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some, but there was, some very bad recessions in the late 1800s. There was a lot of concern about what to do about it. There was the populist movement that wanted more money created and the free coining of silver. The big banks wanted to stop that and were successful in doing so. And the biggest banks were probably involved in creating the big crash of 1907. The alleged incentive for that was to raise a lot of concern about our banking situation and create a demand for a national central bank. And you probably know about the Jekyll Island meeting of 1910 or 11, where these bankers secretly traveled to Jekyll Island in Georgia, had a secret meeting for a couple of weeks where they drafted and crafted the basically the Federal Reserve Act, or it was going to be called, I think, the Aldrich Act. Nelson Aldrich, a senator who had a big ego. He wanted the bank named after him. But they realized to get it through, they better change the name and called it the Federal Reserve, but got that through in 2013 and called it the Reserve to make it sound like there was some backup for money they were creating. But as I think many of you know, the Federal Reserve isn't really federal. It's owned 100%. At least the branches are owned 100% by the banks that own each of the 12 branches. And the New York branch constitutes about over half of the total asset of the reserve, if I'm not mistaken. In the 1920s, Under the Federal Reserve, there was this big expansion and bubble created in stocks that led to the Great Depression. I think it can be said that the Federal Reserve and its lack of proper controls contributed to that. The next phase, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, was one of the measures used to combat the Great Depression. It was actually founded under Herbert Hoover, but he only used it to
So Earl,
yeah, what happened?
your face is only half showing, so you need to change your.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I was muted, and so I called Ibrahima.
Oh, okay. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation under Roosevelt was turned into a very powerful engine to do a lot to lessen the recession. It put about $35 billion into the economy over a period of 12 to 22 years. It did not make all its loans all directly to consumers, but put a great deal of money into the economy. It made a profit, did not really cost the government anything because of the profit it made. And it also did a great deal to fund World War II. And there's a movement today, there's a national bill to reenact something comparable to the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to put much more money into infrastructure. And hopefully that federal bill will move forward. That really completes the discussion of public banks in the United States. I think with the time remaining, we should take questions. There was the postal banks, which is a very good idea from 1911 to 1967. That wasn't a real bank though, but it had the great, the very valuable trait of giving a place for people who were unbanked to have a place to store their money safely and cash checks and that sort of thing. And there's a movement today to recreate that and restore the postal banks, because you can put a small banking section in every post office, which is basically what they did. And that should be done again. And there's an effort to see that that happens. Okay, let's take questions.
And comments. Thanks, Earl. That was really very good, even though I heard you go over that in the past. I still keep learning.
So if you have questions, as usual, you could use the reaction buttons.
And also comments, Ibrahima. We're really wanting to have comments.
Sure. Michael Leroy from London.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I thought that was extremely interesting what you were saying, Earl. And in fact, you mentioned someone early on wrote a book about the early part or a pamphlet. Was it someone called Peter Cooper? Was that the person you mentioned?
No, the pamphlet was by Benjamin Franklin, but it was written anonymously. Franklin, actually, this is an interesting facet of his personality and experience. He was, I think, so far ahead of other people that he learned quickly that people resented someone who was too good, and he often wrote things anonymously, including Madame Dogood was the author of some of his brilliant pieces. recommending social change.
And I found it particularly interesting because I'm from London, and so I'm English to the core, really. But it's interesting what you said about the early United States. In fact, the colonies were, it was by creating their own currency that they were really hitting the lodestone, really, in the sense of finding something that actually has a power to create wealth and everything and freedom and all that. It's
Yes.
I found that particularly interesting, actually, and I shall look into that a bit more, really, because I think it's an aspect of it that's not understood over here, really. We just think we haven't got an understanding of that of American history from that standpoint. So I think you've hit something very interesting there, and I shall.
Thank you, Michael. I should, I think, send to Ibrahima a link of a video or videos by Richard Werner, who is a British economist originally from Germany, where he explains some of what really goes on in finance and how to really fix it.
Yeah, well, I mean, Richard Werner, one of his best books is what's it called? The Princes of the Yen.
Yes.
And when you've seen that, but it really illustrates why Japan was so powerful when they were directing money to their export activities, and it was very powerful direction, really. They were giving the resources for the country only to the exporters. They were depriving their own people of the money, but they were giving all the loans to their exporters. And Richard Werner's book, The Princes of the Yen, we did that years ago here as a course, and I heard a talk by him. But that's
Yes,
a book I would really recommend.
Yes.
Yeah, that's well worth reading. Oliver Liu, I think, was the next person with a question.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, good. I had a question because I'm interested. You said the first U.S. public bank was 80% actually privately owned. Because the first speaker talked about people's resistance. And one thing I get from people when I mention it, they say, "Oh, it's anything to do with the public, it's going to be corrupt."
Wait, you're talking a little too fast. I missed a little bit of the last part.
Okay. I'm curious. Do you know what percentage of the second Bank of the United States was privately owned?
My understanding, it was again around 80%.
Okay. I find that interesting because people, in my experience, whenever you mention public banks, whenever I do, they say anything owned by the public or run by the public is going to be corrupt and inefficient. But they weren't really publicly run or owned; they were private.
Yes.
That's right. That's right. Yes, the railroads was a similar situation in the 1800s. A lot of municipalities made joint investments with railroads, but the railroads had control of a lot of those, and they would speculate, and there was a lot of guesswork on which railroads and cities were going to thrive and which were not. And then there were these repeated recessions, and many of them failed, and the banks walked away with their profits and whatnot, filed bankruptcy, and were out of trouble. But the municipalities went broke, basically. And one consequence of that was not legislation, but constitutional provisions in at least 45 states today that prohibit government to lend their credit, which is not quite the same thing as making loans, but also to prohibit them from joint ventures with private interests, which is what the railroads were and what the first and second Bank of the United States were, where you've got this sort of joint venture where, because of 80% ownership or majority ownership by the private railroads or the private bankers, they want to speculate, maximize profit, and it's very damaging to the real success of the bank. Yeah, or the railroad.
So Ed, we have to have Ed speak up.
Well, I enjoyed listening to a lot of this. Is I'm familiar with, but Alec, your perspective it seems to say to me that what's missing in humanity is a sense of community,
Yes,
and what we need to do is to find ways to rebuild this sense of community. And you've provided us with a list of things that we need to work on, and I think I agree with all of them, actually. Question is transitioning. And how do we, maybe this is an unfair question to you, but politically, how do we get to a critical mass of support for the fundamental reforms that we need to have adopted? I mean,
yes.
that's my
it's a-
question.
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult question. And I frankly don't see it happening unless we take money out of the political system, on the one hand.
Yeah,
I just don't see how it can be done without doing that. And we've actually considered in our public banking discussions here in Colorado that one kind of contribution that public banking can do is to finance elections, so that you don't have to be sold to particular interests in order to express your opinion. The other
Yes,
one,
and another thing it could do is finance independent media.
yes,
Um,
which I mentioned in my presentation, that the media can be very, very corrupting in itself.
Yeah, I mean, it would have to finance it without strings attached,
Yes, absolutely.
but and prohibit it from becoming beholden to private interest.
Well, let me follow up then with a question, and that is constituencies. Okay. We in the United States know we have multiple constituencies, often tied to ideologies that are quite diverse and in perspective. And so it kind of relates to use of public money for public purposes that are not agreed upon. And this is where we have so many problems when we make decisions to spend public money that seem to advance narrowly held views of what constitutes good public policy. And that's I guess what I was asking Alec, how do we get around that? I mean, how do we once again move toward consensus building decision making in the public arena?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that that one way would be this, what Earl just mentioned, is financing public media so that the money issue does not get entangled with viewpoints and opinions, or to attempt to change those opinions that are now tied very, very narrowly with power issues and also money issues. That's one. The other thing that I've come across is something called systemic consensus. It's two Austrian computer people who've put together a different way of voting. And a friend of mine and I are going to offer a class at Ollie Osher Lifelong Learning Institute this fall on this, once we understand it ourselves more. And it's based on the idea that it doesn't go with majority rule, because once you have majority rule, the people that lose, even by only 49%, they tend to oppose immediately the people that won the 51%. So you build in a dualism that inherently is poised to for disagreement and radical disagreement and even violence. There, what you do is you try and find out for any particular policy or any particular idea who is least opposed to it. It's least opposition. That's not my first preference, but I will go along with that one because, I don't have very much opposition. So I find it very, very intriguing. And they've tried it in Austria and in Germany. There isn't an English translation. So a friend of mine who knows German has translated it, but we haven't yet gotten agreement from the publishers that we could publish it here in the United States with that translation, etc.
Could you privately distribute it by email?
Yes, I got the permission from the translator friend to do just that. And he's one of very few people that I know who are friends of mine who's older than me. I'm 80 and he's 82. So
I'd love to read it.
It's very, very intriguing. And once you apparently learn it, it's so easy and so reducing altogether disagreements, anger and violence that, for example, it's been taught to young children. And if they, for example, have 5 options for what game to play, they can very quickly come to this systemic consensus, and nobody gets considered that, they've never taken into consideration and this and that and the other. And they can find out very readily what game they're going to play.
Yeah, I think Alan Reese has a question. I think he's next.
Yes.
Someone mentioned earlier that there were in the early 1800s, there were some private currencies that some of them did pretty well until they became corrupt, of course. Is this similar to cryptocurrencies now? And then also, is it also similar to complementary currencies? And also my last question would be, are complementary currencies currently legal in the United States?
I don't know a lot about that. In general, private currencies can be corrupted. They can be taken over by wealthy interests and then misused for purposes that harm the public interest. I'm generally suspicious of private currencies, but there have been several private currencies. What do you call them? You use the term
Complementary currencies.
yeah, complementary currencies. I know in Ithaca, New York, and there was one here in Denver. The problem with them is that they tend to be limited in scope. They're not big enough to really combat major recessions and things like that, even though it's a good idea. I know Bernard Lietaer has written about the value of those used in certain circumstances that have been really valuable. But one of our reasons for supporting public banking is that it really has the capacity to do much more than these private currencies do. And if it's under public control, it can be directed to purposes that really benefit society instead of cause a lot of harm. One of the things we've mentioned previously, but I want to mention it again today, and Richard Werner emphasizes this, that if you have let's say a national central bank or a state bank, a state public bank, if it includes in its directions or even its statute that it will devote most of its funding to create new goods and services, it's productive and not inflationary because supply and demand are in balance. The If you don't do that, or if it's controlled by private banks, the incentive is to maximize profit for the shareholders, private shareholders. And that leads to investing in existing assets like real estate, or maybe making loans for consumer consumption. That's inflationary, but doesn't help the economy. And with assets, you create asset bubbles and they inevitably collapse. So having direction from the center, but having the actual lending dispersed to local banks that only lend in their own local area where they know the borrowers, they know the businesses, is basically, if it's for productive purposes, non-inflationary and really benefits the economy. And that's the value, one of the values of public banking versus these private currencies that we can't really control and that may end up causing a lot of harm.
Yeah, and Alan, if I might, complementary currencies are not at all opposed to public banking. There's no reason to consider that they wouldn't work together.
Yeah, and they're not illegal, are they?
Not that I know of.
Okay. And where
Because they've already been used in the United States and elsewhere.
I'm in the East Bay in California, and we're trying to get a public bank started here. Cities of Richmond, Berkeley, Oakland have joined, and the county of Alameda have joined in. I'm in San Leandro, and I'm trying to get San Leandro interested. Any suggestions about that? They seem to think they're too small to help.
Yeah, how big is San Leandro?
San Leandro is about 110,000.
That's okay.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
also you can combine it with another town, for example, and work together to create a public bank that would serve both of the towns.
I think that is the idea. It's supposed to be a public bank of the East Bay, which would comprise about 6 or 7 towns plus a whole county.
Yes, yes.
Right, yeah. I think they're designing that East Bay program in a way that would allow your town to eventually join that. Although your town is probably big enough
Yes.
to have its own public bank.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Patricia Lowe, I think, was
Yes,
the
yes,
next
Patricia.
question.
unmute yourself, unmute yourself.
At the lower left of your screen, Patricia?
I got it.
Yes, you got it.
Yeah, I heard, I think just yesterday, like on WHYY radio public station in my neck of the woods in Philly, that Reagan got rid of, no, actually MSNBC was beefing. Reagan got rid of the fairness doctrine in broadcasting. And the whole idea that the fairness doctrine was wrapped up with a broadcast license, that the major networks like CBS, for example, would have to include news and public service programming, at least some news. And then shortly after that happened, CBS took the news division, basically got rid of it. Walter Cronkite was on that, So they got rid of that and they just folded it into their entertainment, and now Disney, ABC, they're shortchanging the news. I've seen Nightline, which is a show out of New York, go from reporting serious news with Ed Koppel, like in the 70s and 80s, whenever it came out, to just reporting on BS now, and gossip. So I don't know how to take care of that with broadcasting, absent the idea of, public airways and the public licenses should be issued with these public service requirements.
Yes, and that is with the idea of having we the people be in government. I mean, these airwaves belong to the American people.
Yeah,
and so
that's
you
right.
have to have people in government who look to serve with the ownership of these airwaves to serve the public good.
Yeah.
If we can
In
recognize
exchange for
what
the
it is.
monopoly, because you can't have multiple broadcasters over the, adjacent frequencies or the
Well,
same.
of course,
frequency.
like radio. Yes, yes, Ed. Again,
I just wanted to add a little bit to the history of banking in response to sort of Alan's questions, and maybe he's already familiar with the history of free banking. Do you know what that, are you familiar with that term, Alan?
No.
Free banking?
No.
Okay, well, there's a period of time in the United States when it was perfectly legal for people in a community to organize a bank and print their own bank notes. And one of the
Right.
virtues, a colleague of ours who unfortunately passed away a bit ago, Fred Foldvari, has written extensively in favor of free banking. The idea basically is that people trust the bank will accept the notes at par value, at face value. If
Yeah.
they don't trust the bank, then those notes will be discounted. And generally, in the history of free banking, the further away the commerce occurred from the bank's location, the more the bank notes were discounted.
Yeah.
And there's been, historians, economists have argued, whether or not free banking was positive or negative. But in the frontier days, when money was extremely scarce, free banking is pretty much supported that free banking helped to spur economic development.
Yeah.
Now, this doesn't in any way conflict with the idea of public banking as a superior solution.
Yeah.
But it was the solution of many communities during their expansionist days before that we had a national currency, before we had the Federal Reserve System.
Well, that's right. But under Lincoln, $450 million was created without creating debt. Under the 13 colonies, money was created without creating debt. And if by law you're required to spend that money for new goods and services that serve the public interest, that are for sustainable things, for example, that don't harm the environment, don't damage human health, that is a vastly superior way to what happened in the late 1800s, which was we didn't have money. It was cut off. The greenbacks were cut off, and they denied the ability to use silver as it could have been used. And so there was this recession. And yes, as a backup method, that free banking did help, but it also created problems of its own, because a lot of confusion and these different currencies, and people didn't know to trust its value or whether to trust its value or not. I think, prefer a system that has carefully controlled public banks, but where the banks are at local levels and places where they know the borrowers and they lend for productive purposes. I think the benefits to the society are a lot better, and the economy can be much more stable if you're not lending to inflate assets, because you're then avoiding these bubbles and the recession, just as the Bank of North Dakota has, and the German Sparkassen, and also the bank in Alberta has had a more stable role than the private banks ever had.
So before we leave, because we're
Alec, I
After-
see that, I know we are running out of time, but I
That's
see
right.
Joe Polito and Tom Rossman wanting to ask questions.
Oh, okay, very good.
Give them a chance. Let's
Sure,
go with
sure.
Joe.
Thank you. Just one little observation. Thank you very much for these great presentations. And you're reminding us that there's several ways that our elected representatives can exercise the political will to make sure our resources are used for the benefit of the public. And it's good to hear there's another way to skin a cat. Joe Bongiovanni and I belong to Alliance for Just Money, and we're kind of dedicated to the NEED Act, which is about monetary reform. And you mentioned that at the beginning of your
Yes.
presentations. But this is another great way of moving in the right direction. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Joe.
Who
Tom
else?
Roth.
Yes, yeah, hi. So great presentation. I just wanted to comment a little bit on what Alec was talking about, and having studied revolutions and social movements extensively. Part of the problem with something like this is that banking is a very complex topic. So when you start talking about banking and money, you run into a situation where people have a hard time really understanding it. And you'll notice like a lot of the people making comments are people who know a lot about banking already and have experience in the industry. So they're very accustomed to thinking about that topic and discussing it. But for the majority of people, when you start talking about money and banking, it kind of their eyes glaze over. So it really becomes kind of a difficult position. And then, the other, as you mentioned about the opposition, Alec, the concentration of wealth in the financial industry is so significant, even local banks.
Oh, yes.
You'll notice that, any kind of reform that comes up, at one point there were 5 financial industry lobbyists for every lawmaker in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And that's probably, and a perfect example of that is what happened to Dodd-Frank. It turned out to be 700 and some pages. And they had a team of lawyers working on every little line and paragraph. And the lawmakers and the regulators just don't have the personnel and the staff and the resources to be able to match that. And so it's that concentrate, just similar to like the gun lobby, right? It's a small group of people who are very highly motivated and concentrated and are able to make a big difference. So I think the challenge really becomes how do you make this a topic that you can communicate to people in a clear way that also has an emotional connection where you can move them to take action, because
Yes.
the larger consciousness raising is absolutely true. There's no question about that. And having community values versus individual values, most people don't think about it in those terms. And so having an example where you can illustrate that is a powerful way to really get that communication process going. And of course, having that emotional connection is really essential to moving the ball forward.
That's right. I want to again highly recommend Richard Werner's videos and his articles where he explains for the first time and tests for the first time ever how banks create money. And he makes issues that used to be considered very complex much simpler. If instead of having 3 different theories, conflicting theories, mutually exclusive theories about how money's created, and realize only one of them is correct, and you choose the right one, it changes and allows a clear decisions to be made about how you regulate the economy, shows that the current system of capital adequacy will not work, cannot work, that the Fed and the Bank for International Settlements uses. It shows that not putting restrictions on lending so that they're used for productive purposes is extremely harmful, because when it's just used as the private banks may do to lend for consumer goods or to inflate assets, including real estate, stocks, or commodities, it leads to bubbles and recessions unavoidably. And once those concepts are cleared up, it's much easier to understand banking. It's not that complicated, but we owe a great debt, I think, to Richard Werner for explaining how these things really work and how they can be fixed.
But
Yeah.
Earl, you must confess how long it took us to understand it, that we're immersed both in legal and also economy. So you can't, yes, eventually it becomes really simple, but it's not originally, and it takes quite a bit of time to get to clarity. And that's what was asked about initially. And Warner is very, very clear and has provided a very great service in doing what he's done. But the connection with feelings and emotions is not there in Warner.
Is not there what?
He's not there. He doesn't communicate a warmth that is necessary, as the previous speaker suggested, that you need the clarity, but you also need the connection that has to do with
show how it communicates with the community.
yes, that's right. That's right.
Well, he's an economist. I wouldn't.
What's what
I
you say
wouldn't.
about
I
economists?
wouldn't. I think he's a very good communicator, and I think he does have the emotion. He's not an orator, but once you understand it clearly, what we need to do is very clear.
No,
And
no, but
that's
Do you have some specific things, Earl, that you would recommend that instead of just doing an open search, do you have a couple of links that you can send out to give his best hits?
Yes, both videos and his articles.
Okay.
yes.
Definitely. Yeah, and some are shorter. They're in 12 minutes where he hits the highlights really well through a big, very professional crowd, and also the Rhodes Forum, which is in Alec's country of Greece, the island of Rhodes, an hour and 19 minutes, and he's just very clear, and it makes it so clear what we need to do once you understand that. And if I had heard him at first in 2010, when I first began reading about this, I think it would have greatly shortened the track to grasping how all these things fit together. I mean, Alec's correct. He's not the most impassioned communicator, but he does make very clear, and he emphasizes what we need to do.
I'm all in favor, Earl. I just say that we have work to do in that capacity to connect people in another realm. He's done what he's really very good at doing. If there are no more questions or comments, next week we'll be doing the history of the Bank of North Dakota, and the last week of the fifth week we'll be going over the efforts that we've had in Colorado, including two bills that we've put together, one for local banks and the other one for a state bank. And we would like then to we will send those to you in a day or so. It will come from Earl so that you can take a look at them and offer us suggestions, things to change, things that don't sound good, things that are not clear, that sort of thing. That's one. And then the second thing is that, Ed, you need to tell people, not only today, but the next two times as well, about your class that starts August 3rd, because it has to do with land value tax and public banking and a review of those and how they can collaborate. I think that's what you said last time.
Well, it's a little bit more involved than that.
Okay.
It's going to deal with an analysis of economic cycles, the history of cycles, the causes of cycles, and I'm going to try to explore and integrate how Henry George's analysis combines with the various proposals for modern monetary theory in terms of money creation, as well as public banking and other economic reforms that will bring it all together and the objective of this series of lectures is to discuss how we can stabilize economic growth, how we can prevent recessions and depressions, and what some of the main ideas of how to do that are. So it's going to be very sweeping with a lot of charts and graphs and statistics. So,
okay, well,
hopefully,
that's good. So all I want to say is to let people know, and I'm sure that Ibrahima is going to advertise that, because I think it's very, very useful. and also goes in the direction that I like very much, is how do you turn ideas into action?
Great.
Can I just mention, gentlemen, I put in the chat a link to Werner. I think it's a 7-minute excerpt from a larger piece, and it really captures where he's coming from. It's a very progressive use of money that he advocates.
Yeah, very good, Joe. Yeah, I want to add that Werner does show how to end the so-called business cycle, the boom and bust. And that's one of the greatest things about a properly run public bank.
Great. Thank you very much, Alec and Earl, for a very fine talk tonight. And we look forward to seeing you all next week. For,
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Ibrahima, for connecting us.
Yes, thank you.
Pleasure here. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Nice.